Well, thanks everybody for coming today on talking about using native alternatives to invasive exotic garden plants. These are plants that you may have in your garden, you may have seen in other people's gardens, or you may see them kind of out there in the world. And as David said, I'm a relatively new master gardener. I've been gardening for a while, but we actually, in our Rensselaer County Master Gardeners, we have a subgroup, a working group on native plants. And this program really was developed out of conversations that we've been having in that group. And I've recently I joined that subgroup because I have become more interested in gardening with natives. A lot of times we develop our gardens based on what's going to look good, sequence of blooms and heights and colors. But we want you to think a little bit beyond just the visual aspect and think more about how does our gardening habit affect the ecosystem. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. So this has been, putting this together has been a very interesting, exciting experience for me to learn so much about these plants. So Betsy is also going to be doing part of this program. So Betsy, why don't you introduce yourself?
I am in Cathy's class, Master Gardener class. We had our training in the fall of 2018, and during that training, there was a session on invasive plants, and I think many of us were quite struck with this. And we talked among ourselves saying, oh my goodness, I didn't know I had so many in my yard. And so that sort of moves you on then to native plants. So the two go hand in hand, and it's totally changed the way I'm thinking and the way I'm gardening. So it's very exciting, and it's always fun to do something new, but something that's important as well.
Great, thanks, Betsy. Also, this is very timely because this is National Invasive Plant Week. So not that we're celebrating that, but we're actually looking at that and saying, how do we address this? So that's what we're going to be doing today. Also, you'll notice that Becky Raymond's name is also on this. She's a member of our working group as well and contributed to putting this program together. And then, as David said, we have Rhonda Rumsey Van Hovelen and Teresa Murphy, and we have Barbara Newfer also that are going to be monitoring the chat and kind of helping to answer some of the questions. So we're going to get started, and just to kind of take you down the garden path and show you where we're going to be going in this next little bit of time, we're going to start with some definitions so that we're making sure that we're kind of all on the same page. We're all talking about using the same language, and then we will discuss why we're even suggesting that you should incorporate native plants into your gardens and perhaps even replace some of your plants with natives. So we'll talk about that, and then we'll do kind of an overview of New York State's perspective on invasive plants, and they've actually have a document that I'll share with you that highlights 75 plants that are considered invasive in New York State. And then since there are 75 and we couldn't do all 75, we picked 10 of the common invasives that you're most likely to find in kind of home gardens or landscapes, or maybe even plants that you might have gone out and brought into your property for decorative purposes. So we're going to look at 10 of those plants, and then we'll identify 2 alternatives that you could plant instead of those plants. And also what we'll try to do is, invasive plants were planted for a reason. Most of them came from Europe, from Asia, from the Middle East, but they were brought here as ornamentals or to provide some other kind of function, maybe for erosion control or something along those lines. So they had a function, they had a reason. So what we'll try to do is talk about how natives can actually provide some of those same kind of desirable characteristics as the invasives. And then also we'll talk about features of these alternatives that make them beneficial to have in your garden as well. And then there were a lot of resources that went into putting this program together, and we'll highlight a few of those resources. And then just so you know, when we get to the end, we're going to actually provide some resources for where you can purchase native plants in local area, as well as the web resources that were used to develop this program. we'll also, after the program is over, we are being recorded, I think, David?
That's right. It'll be on our YouTube channel.
That'll be on the Cornell Cooperative Extension of Rensselaer County YouTube channel, but we will also be sending you out a resource list, so you don't have to try to scramble and write down all those dots and slashes and everything for the resources. So I'm going to turn this over to Betsy to kind of get us started with some definitions and some whys.
Okay. First of all, I'm going to give a definition of native plants. There, you can see lots of different definitions of native plants, but generally they contain these 4 characteristics. A native plant is a plant that has evolved naturally within a particular ecoregion prior to European settlement. This definition requires a geographical qualifier. In other words, you need to specify what particular region you're talking about. It could be the Northeast of the US, it could be New York State, it could be Rensselaer County, it could even be your EPA ecoregion, which you can find online, which tries to put you in an area that has characteristics that are similar. So the plant, this native plant within this particular ecoregion can thrive in the local soils and rainfall levels, weather, and climate conditions. It has evolved codependently with the local wildlife in the soil biota over actually hundreds of thousands of years. And this is an important point because evolution moves very slowly. So even if a plant has been here, came over with the Europeans, it hasn't really had enough time to evolve and interact with the local wildlife, which is important because this means that it will be able to be used by the local wildlife. And since it's a plant, it's going to be using energy from the sun and passing this up through the food chain. But it can't do that if it can't interact with the wildlife. And that's one of the problems and one of the major features of going toward native plants. Native plants contribute the best valuable ecological services within your ecoregion. And you'll hear about some of those in just a minute. At the bottom of the page are a few pictures of native plants in our region. This is Helenium to the left, bee balm, and oak leaf hydrangea. And as you learn more and more about native plants, you'll get to know the ones that are specific for your area. And next, I'll talk about non-native plants. These are often called exotic, alien, or introduced. These plants have not evolved naturally within a particular ecoregion. They've been introduced into it. But they do often thrive locally in the soils, rainfall, weather, and climate conditions. However, because they thrive, they can compete with the native plants for the resources that the native uses. And this competition is usually or often successful. Now, as I mentioned in the last slide, they're unable to contribute to the food web because they haven't evolved. And the thing is that we need the food web in order for plants to pass on the energy they receive from the sun up the food web. And if this isn't able to happen, then the whole food web collapses. And it may sound dire, but it's actually true. And non-native plants do contribute some ecological services, but many at a significantly lower level. Now, this doesn't mean you can't have them in your garden. Some of the flowers that we've pictured below, the peonies, daylilies, and lilacs, we've had in our garden for years, and they do contribute something in terms of pollen and nectar and cover, and some animals may even use them to produce their young. But the service level is usually a little lower. But the thing is that many of these non-native plants become invasive. In fact, they're 40% more likely to become invasive by some characteristic, by some criteria. And the invasive plants are often harmful. So invasive plants are always non-native. I mean, native plants can be garden thugs and they can move around, but we wouldn't consider them invasive per se. The invasive plants are invasive because they thrive in the local soils with the rainfall levels there, weather and climate conditions, and they compete very successfully and replace native plants, often creating monocultures and importantly, reducing the biodiversity of the area. And again, they lack coevolution and are not able to contribute to the food web, and they have limited ecological services. That is, that often the pollen and nectar they produce for pollinators is at a lower level. And the overall effect is negative, causing economic or human harm. Now, as I said before in the last slide, there's no reason why you can't use non-natives in your landscape as long as they're not invasive. But the important thing to realize is that you can't have all non-native plants, or your yard is much less useful than if you include the natives. So keep your favorite ornamentals, but don't make them the major part of your landscape. Why should we use native plants? Well, we talked about this a little bit before, but as Cathy mentioned, you can't emphasize enough that in the way we traditionally have gardened, we've concentrated on the beauty or aesthetic value of it, but it doesn't support our local ecosystems as well as using native plants. Unfortunately, many suburban yards look like this picture. They have no native plants. They have little or nothing in the way of food or shelter for birds and pollinators and other wildlife. And the lawn is something that native gardeners are focusing on all over, because the lawn isn't doing much for the environment. It's green, it photosynthesizes, but nobody's using it. And so it may be pretty, but it's what some people term a pollinator desert. It doesn't provide anything for the wildlife. Of course, this way of gardening makes things easy for you. You don't have to worry about the bugs because you've used pesticides to get rid of them. And you've used fertilizer to make the lawn nice and lush. But again, it's rather sterile. Doug Tallamy is an entomologist from the University of Delaware, and he's written a couple of very definitive books for native gardeners. One is, the most recent is Nature's Best Hope, and his other one that has been very informative is called Bringing Nature Home. And in these books, he's described why we should look to native gardening. And he says that 80% of plants in a typical American yard are species that evolved from Asia, Europe, and South America. And they, as we mentioned before, they can't support the complex food webs necessary for our ecosystem. But he says that we can attract attractive landscapes that will sustain these ecological services, which is complex food webs, storing carbon, managing our watersheds, rebuilding our soils, and supporting a diversity of pollinators and wildlife. He's proposed, and for me, his major take-home point is that we can make a difference if we turn our landscapes and of the areas that are close to us into environments, because they contain the native plants and the wildlife acting as a unit, that we can make a difference. We can make a difference all over. He calls it this, he's trying to promote a movement called Homegrown National Park, which the bottom line is turn your garden into a little park. And if enough people do this, we'll expand our national park system exponentially, and it's a wonderful idea. Now, going back for a minute to the invasives, if we're going to do this, of course, the first step will be to look at our backyard and see what we have. In my backyard, I could identify quite a number of invasive species. Then the next step is to remove them. But how do we do this on a larger scale? Well, first of all, the identification is important, and I'll show you at the end what you can do if you want to participate on a larger scale. So the first thing is to identify, and the next thing is regulation, which Cathy's going to talk about, so that we can keep these plants out of our system, so we're not tempted to buy them, nor are others. And thirdly, we will then remove them, but you don't want to remove them and leave a waste land there for other thugs to move in. Instead, you want to replace. So it's usually remove and replace are said in the same sentence. So now Cathy's going to tell you about how to do this.
All right. Well, we're going to start by taking a look at this is the document that I mentioned earlier that identifies the 75 invasive plants that have been so nominated in New York State. There's terrestrial plants, there's wetland plants, and then there are aquatic plants. And as I said, there are 75 of them. And New York State, the Department of Environmental Conservation and the Department of Agriculture and Markets have sort of divided these groups of plants up into regulated plants and prohibited plants. And I'll explain that a little bit as we go along. We're going to look at, I think we're going to look at 4 regulated plants and then 6 actual prohibited plants. So these are the ones that we're going to take a look at today, again, out of our 75. The 4 regulated plants, first we have burning bush, and then we have the Miscanthus species. There are about 25 plants in that species that are considered, they're all considered invasive. Sweet autumn clematis, Norway maple, those are regulated. And then our prohibited plants, we have Japanese barberry, yellow flag iris, garden loosestrife, porcelain berry, Oriental bittersweet, and we also have border privet. So let's start with these regulated plants. So how does New York State define a regulated invasive plant? So these are plants that you can buy them, you can sell them, you can propagate them, you can give them to your friend, you can move them around in your own garden. What you can't do is you can't introduce them into like public lands, what we refer to as free living state. So you can't plant them along the roadway or in a forest service area. So they're regulated, and you'll see these. You can buy these in nurseries, and when you go to the garden center and you look at them, there are some code words that are used that you can kind of look for. If you're not quite sure, if you don't have a list in front of you, and actually what I do now when I go to a garden center is I actually take my list of native plants with me. But if you didn't have that, how do you know? Well, they might say something like fast growth rate, requires vigorous pruning, has a vigorous growth habit. Those are clues to you that you might be dealing with an invasive plant. So let's take a look at our very first one, which is the burning bush. And again, you can see there's reasons why people planted this. Look at it. It's got that interesting, you can see this interesting stem structure, beautiful fall color. It's very adaptable. You can grow it in urban areas. You can grow it in suburban areas. It's got an interesting growth habit, that mounded growth, produces lots of seeds that are very hardy. So now you can see where we're heading towards invasiveness. And if you look in that bottom picture, bottom picture, you can see what happens when it escapes out into these open areas where it just forms these incredible thickets that outcompete the native plants that might be trying to grow underneath those thickets that they have. So in this, again, it can grow up to 20 feet in height, 20 feet in width. So there's some issues around this burning bush. So what could you do instead? What could you plant instead? So here's a suggestion. We could start with dwarf fothergilla, and this is also known as dwarf witch alder. This plant prefers part shade, but it actually does better in full sun if you give it lots of water. You're going to get better flower production. You're going to get those beautiful reds and oranges and yellows that create some of that color that you would want to get from a burning bush. You can get that with this plant that's not particularly invasive. It's hardy in zones 5 through 8. Now, all the plants that I'll be presenting are hardy in up to zone 5. Some of them go up to like zone 3, and I'll point those out. But all of them are hardy to zone 5. This is going to grow maybe 2 or 3 feet tall, and you get this beautiful fall color. It's great for pollinators. You can see that from that kind of bottle brush type plant. Not usually damaged by deer, but I could say that with a caveat that resources may indicate that it actually is a deer-resistant plant. But your area, your deer, what they're going to come in and eat. I know 2 years ago I had deer that came and just ate everything that wasn't supposed to be eaten by deer. So take it with a grain of salt. That's what the resources say, but your area as well. So that's one possibility to replace burning bush. What else could you do? Here's an interesting one. How about the high bush blueberry? Look at that beautiful fall color that you get. And of course you get those wonderful berries as well. Full to partial sun, but it likes those open areas. It will naturalize best in open areas, and that's going to produce more flowers, better fall color. It does require acidic soil, and Betsy and I were having a conversation about this, that if you have to amend your soil in order for something to grow there, then is it truly native? But that's a conversation for another time. But it's just a thought. So if you didn't have acidic soil, you would have to do some amendments for it. It grows, 6, maybe up to 12 feet tall, and it produces this beautiful fall foliage and those berries that are very desirable by wildlife and also by humans. I mean, they're edible for us as well. These, the high bush blueberry attracts 30 species of birds. So if you like bluebirds, you like tanagers, you like towhees, cardinals, catbirds, they're all attracted to this, this plant. It's also attractive to native bees, and it is not deer resistant. That's a real clear one. You'd have to do some type of protection if you wanted to grow this and you didn't want to share it with the native wildlife. Some other alternatives I just mentioned down at the bottom. For each of those, I'll try to give you a couple additional alternatives. Red or black chokeberry, eastern ninebark. Ninebark's become a popular plant that we're seeing more and more in landscapes. It's relatively easy to find in garden centers, relatively inexpensive. So that's another desirable plant that you could plant, or a type of Amsonia. So what's our next invasive species? This is again a regulated, the Miscanthus. And as I said, there are about 25 species of Miscanthus. One of the most popular is the Chinese silvergrass, Miscanthus sinensis. And that was actually identified as in 2017 as the November invasive of the month by the Maryland Invasive Species Organization. But again, you can see why people plant this. It's beautiful. It's got these beautiful plumes that waft in the breeze, and while it's wafting, it's actually pollinating itself. So those seeds are shooting all over the place. They're tiny little seeds that get widely dispersed, and you can see in that bottom picture that what happens when it escapes, and you get these giant clumps that are really difficult. Even in your own home gardens, if you have this, it's almost time to bring in the backhoe to get them out because they can become very dense clumps. So this is a challenging one to deal with. One of the things you can do is actually you can remove those seed heads before you can actually, once it starts to go to flower, and you can remove those so that it doesn't produce seed. That certainly would limit somewhat the invasive nature of it. So what could you plant instead? Here's a sweet plant, a little blue stem. And this is prefers full sun, but it grows in a lot of different soil conditions, and it forms like a mound, maybe 2 to 4 feet tall. As I said, it's pretty tolerant of. You can see where it's growing here, and these don't look like particularly nutritious soil, but it keeps its color. See, it has that beautiful color. It'll keep its color all winter, and it's very attractive to birds and to butterflies. It's the material is used for nesting, and it claims to be high deer resistant. So that's one possibility. Here's another one, switchgrass. This prefers full sun, but it will grow in some part shade. And again, you can get that same sort of effect that the Miscanthus produces with the plumes. And this also will keep its color. And what's really nice about this particular plant is the seed plumes persist long into winter, so it provides a really good food source during the winter time for our birds that overwinter in our area. This also is really tolerant of a variety of soil types. This will grow maybe up to 6 feet tall, so it's a little bit taller than our little blue stem. It's also the larval host to a couple different skipper butterflies, the Delaware skipper and the dotted skipper, and it also claims to be pretty deer resistant. A couple other alternatives at the bottom: big blue stem, Indian grass, and bottlebush grass. Some other alternatives. Here's our next regulated plant, and this is the sweet autumn clematis. It comes by its name naturally. It has these very fragrant, showy flowers. It's a climbing vine, And you can see what happens in that bottom picture, that it can really take off and grow up to 20 feet in length and produces lots of seeds, and those seeds are dispersed by the wind. And what can happen is it will invade those open areas along the edge of the road or a stream bank, along those things. It forms those really dense thickets. And again, these plants tend to outcompete the native flora. So this one actually, interestingly, there were a couple different invasive plants. The Arnold Arboretum in Boston actually imported a lot of these different invasives as ornamentals. And many of these were imported in the mid to late 1800s. This one comes from, it's native to Japan, to China, and to Korea. So what could you plant instead? Here's a different clematis that you could plant. This is Clematis virginiana, virgin's bower, or also known as devil's darning needles, great name for it, and woodbine is another name for it. This is full depart shade, and it'll tolerate a fair amount of shade. This one is hardy up to zone 3, so it should do well in our area. And the plants that we are incorporating are all native to New York State. They're not specific to, like, we're in Rensselaer County, because we know that there might be people from other counties. And I will mention at the end a resource that you can go to actually get a list of what plants are specifically native to your county. So I'll mention that at the end. This will grow, again, it's a vine, so it can grow up to 20 feet, just like the invasive one, but it's much more manageable when it's in your property. The flowers are a little smaller, not as fragrant, but very numerous, as you can see from these pictures. This is really attractive to lots of pollinators, to bees, wasps, butterflies, moths. It's the larval host to the Clematis clearwing moth. It's also used as nesting habitat for songbirds. The plants are dioecious, they're either male or female, and the male plants tend to produce flowers that are a little more attractive to bees, but I'm not sure when you go to a garden center if they're going to tell you whether you're getting a male or a female, but that's just a note. Interesting, I had to do a quick change because I was going through this program and I was looking at the picture that I had for this Virginiana, and I was looking carefully and I said, I think that I made a mistake, and actually had a picture of the sweet autumn in there. The way you can tell them apart is if you look at these leaves here, they have a very jagged edge. That's a real telltale sign. The invasive clematis has very smooth, rounded edge. So that's, if you're looking, that's a hint for you. So there's one choice. I thought this was a really kind of interesting plant. This is called groundnut. It's in the pea family, and you can kind of see that pea family flower shape to it. It's also known as hopness. That's the Lenape name for it. This plant grows tubers along the rhizomes, and those tubers were actually eaten by Native Americans, and the Native Americans taught the Pilgrims how to eat, and probably saved quite a few lives in teaching them how to eat some of the native plants. It's a climbing vine, as you can see, and it's likes full sun, but it'll take a little bit of light shade. And this was also hardy up to zone 3. It can grow up to 10 feet, so you do have to pay attention to it. But you can manage it if you're working in your yard with this. It's very attractive to different varieties of bees, honeybees, bumblebees, leaf-cutting bees. But it is also somewhat desired by rodents and by deer, so you would have to attend to that a little bit. So that's another possibility. So here's our next regulated plant. This is such a common tree that we see in landscapes all over the place, the Norway maple. It is a regulated plant in New York State. It's really hardy. It'll grow just about anywhere. And the problem is when it escapes, you can see in that bottom picture that it just develops this, you get this kind of monotypic community. And it has a very shallow root system. And as a result, the native plants have difficulty getting a footing underneath these colonizations out in natural areas. We grow it though because it's really easy to grow in urban environments. It tolerates sulfur dioxide, it tolerates ozone, so it can thrive in urban areas, it can thrive in forests. Also, the problem with that root system, that shallow root system in urban areas, is that it can do some real damage to the pavement. So it's a bit of a challenge. So we have some alternatives that you could plant. If you really like that maple look, you could plant a sugar maple instead. This is a native plant. It'll grow it's best in sun, but it'll grow right up into pretty much full shade. You can get a fairly decent growth out of it. It grows tall, like a Norway maple does, but it's a slower growing plant, maybe 1 to 2 feet a year. And this is hardy up through zone 3. It creates that beautiful fall foliage that we all love when we think about those maples. It's really nice because it flowers really early. So it's especially important for those pollinators that are looking for some nectar, some early nectar. So it's a great plant to provide early flowering. It's attractive also to honeybees. And this is a plant that was suggested there's an organization called the Cornell Urban Horticultural Institute, and they identify what plants are good to grow in urban areas. And they identify the sugar maple as one of the good alternatives for urban areas. So maybe you're looking for something other than a maple. So you could grow a basswood, also known as the American linden tree. Full depart shade it will grow in. This one's hardy all the way up to zone 2. So it's a pretty hardy tree. It's not particularly good in urban areas because it's not really tolerant of air pollution, urban conditions, but it has these white flowers that are really attractive to bees. I also mentioned down below the Freeman maple. Freeman maple is actually a hybrid of red and sugar maples, and it's been also identified by the Cornell Urban Cultural Institute as a possibility. It is also recommended for urban plantings. The challenge with the Freeman maple is because it's a hybrid, it tends to be less hardy than our native species. So it may not do as well. It may not be tolerant of diseases. It may not be tolerant of climate change, but it is another alternative. So now we're going to shift to our prohibited plants. And the way that New York State designates these is it's actually illegal to buy them, to sell them, to transport them, to propagate them, to introduce them. So these are the ones that, as Betsy was mentioning, if you have these in your garden or your landscape, you might consider removing them so that we reduce the spread of these particular plants. And as I said, there are 69 prohibited invasive plants. Most of them are considered weeds, but not all. Some of them actually do have ornamental characteristics. Sometimes they have been cultivated to grow in our gardens. And we'll look at 6 of these that we're most likely to find in our gardens or our landscapes. So here's our first one, really common. Everybody has seen this one. I can remember this from when I was a kid, seeing this plant, the Japanese barberry. It has a lot of ornamental appeal. It's shade tolerant, but once it gets into those sunny areas, take a look at what happens down in this picture. You can just see that it absolutely takes over and it outcompetes just anything else that's trying to grow under there. Not a lot of predators, natural predators. Again, it hasn't co-evolved here. An interesting thing about this is these barberry tend to harbor these small rodents, which are the vectors for the black-legged ticks, which is the vector for Lyme disease. So another good reason that we don't necessarily want to allow this in our gardens. So instead, how about something a little bit different? This is summer sweet. And summer sweet does have kind of a yellow to orange fall color. So you're going to get some of that same color that you might be looking for with the barberry. Full sun to part shade. And this one, I live in Rensselaer County and I have basically clay and till in my yard. And this will tolerate clay soil, and it also tolerates some pretty dense shade. Typically goes 3 to 6 feet tall. And the flowers, you can see those beautiful flowers that are very attractive to bees, to butterflies, to hummingbirds. Songbirds are also drawn to this, like robins, goldfinches, warblers. Swallowtail butterflies are also attracted to the summer sweet. Here's another alternative, the red osier dogwood or the red twig dogwood. This is, again, creates that beautiful red colored twig that's just beautiful. And it can grow in a fairly wide variety of conditions. It's hardy up to zone 2, and it can grow anywhere from 3 up to 9 feet tall with maybe a 10-foot spread at maturity. You can plant it as a hedge. And the fruits, those little white fruits that you can see, they're very valuable for wildlife. There are over 98 species of birds that are attracted to the fruit and also use the plant as shelter. So if you like flickers and you like tanagers, catbirds, woodpeckers, they're all attracted to this particular plant. It's also the larval host for the spring azure butterfly. So it's attractive to birds and to butterflies. It can be used for erosion control if you have slopes or areas that you're trying to hold back. It claims to be deer resistant, but again, you know your area. A couple other alternatives, winterberry or the Virginia sweet spire, bayberry, and there again, another alternative, that Eastern ninebark comes up again as another possibility. So yellow flag iris is another prohibited plant. And again, beautiful showy bloom that you get, that beautiful yellow bloom. But the problem with this particular plant, this was native to Europe, to the Mediterranean region. It tends to grow in these kind of shallow wetland areas or sort of muddy areas. And it was actually has been used in sewage treatment because it is known to remove metals from wastewater. However, you can see what happens when the rhizomes from this form these giant clumps. It can crowd out the native cattails, any other native irises that might be there. And you can have several hundred plants that are connected through this rhizome. So once it's established, it can become very difficult to remove. Also, the seed pods from this can float on water for up to 7 months. So it's hardy, and it tends to allow itself to go between the rhizomes and the seed pods. And the rhizomes can actually break off and form new plants. So it's like a triple threat in some ways. Very few native wildlife species will actually use this plant for habitat because it is poisonous. It does, it contain these glycosides that's toxic, especially to our grazing animals. So this is a one that you actually, if you have this, you don't really want to compost it. Actually, anything that grows by rhizomes, if you're trying to remove them, it's not a good idea to compost those. It's really best to bag them and let them rot and then dispose of them in your trash so that you don't risk the chance of them spreading. So instead, here's a couple alternatives. I just love this plant. I think it's just such a sweet little plant. The white turtlehead. It comes by its name, honestly, because Chelone, the genus name, is actually Greek for tortoise. Grows best in sun, little part shade. It'll tolerate some shade. It's hardy up to zone 3. Grows maybe up to 4 feet, probably. Mine doesn't grow up to 4 feet. Maybe it gets 2.5, 3 feet tall. This is a real interesting plant. It blooms late. I'm always kind of waiting for my turtlehead to bloom. It'll bloom July through September. So if you're looking for something with a kind of a later bloom, this would be a good choice. You can get these white flowers. You can actually, there are some varieties that are pink, but you get that white with that kind of lavender tipped opening to it. Very attractive to birds, to butterflies and hummingbirds. It is a host plant for the caterpillars of the Baltimore checker spot. And because it actually does have some bitter leaves, so it tends to be pretty deer resistant. I'm trying to remember, I think that was one of the plants in my garden a couple of years ago that the deer did not eat. So if you like that iris shape, we do have native irises, and this is one, blue flag iris. It grows in full sun to part shade. It's hardy up to zone 3. Grows 2 to 3 feet tall, and it really does form those rhizome clumps. But this will grow in really wet areas. It can grow up to 2 to 4 inches of standing water. So if you have an area that's low lying, or you have a rain garden, this would be a plant that would work really well in there. It's very attractive to birds and to hummingbirds, but it is toxic. It does have that, it's moderately toxic, not as toxic as the yellow flag. But the interesting thing about this one, the rhizome, if you take if you take the roots of these and you dry them and powder them, it's called orris, and that is actually smells like violets, and it is added to perfumes and to potpourris. It's kind of an interesting tidbit about the blue flag iris, and it is pretty deer tolerant, again, because it has that toxicity to it. Another alternative would be a cardinal flower. I think that shows up again as an alternative as well. The next one is, this is a prohibited plant. It's the garden loosestrife. And it's important, this is to differentiate between this and the purple loosestrife. The Lysmachia is in the primrose family, and it is not related to the purple loosestrife, which is actually in the loosestrife family. So they're two kind of entirely different plants. That's why it's important to use the scientific names, because it's easy to, the common names get easily confused. But this garden loosestrife, and this Lysmachia vulgaris, is a prohibited plant, and you grow it because you get this sort of cluster of yellow flowers at the top of the stem. But if you look at that, what can happen is those rhizomes can go long and far, 33 feet long. So you can see how it can form these very dense clumps. It's usually found in sort of wetter areas, and those clumps outcompete our native plants. And there is concern that this may become as invasive as the purple loosestrife. This has a cousin, Lysmachia punctata, which unfortunately is also known as garden loosestrife, but more commonly referred to as yellow loosestrife. It has a similar shaped flower, but the flowers grow like in a whorl down the stem. And I actually have the punctata in my garden. And it's not too bad. It does sort of send out some rhizomes, but it can be, you can manage it pretty well. There's another one that you don't want to compost. You want to let rot in a bag somewhere and get rid of it. So how about instead, if you're looking for that kind of flower cluster sort of at the top, this is a fireweed. And fireweed, again, it comes by its name pretty honestly, because it is a plant that often will repopulate areas that have been burned over after fires. So it really likes kind of open sunny areas. It can grow maybe up to 6 feet tall, 4 to 6 feet tall. It can get really, really tall if you allow it to. But the interesting thing about this plant is that it doesn't really handle competition real well. So if you're planting it with other things, that may help to kind of create a check and balance for it. It's in the evening primrose family. It does have a tendency, as I said, it colonizes these burned over areas. It does have a tendency to become a little aggressive, so you have to tend to it. You have to watch the rhizomes. But it's very attractive to pollinators, to hummingbirds, to butterflies, native bees, moths. It produces a lot of nectar, and it's kind of a rich, spicy honey that it produces that's very attractive to pollinators. It's also a larval host plant for a couple different moths, the bedstraw moth and the white-lined sphinx moth. And you can actually use the leaves of this to make tea. That's one alternative. Here's another one, the obedient plant. Again, you get that kind of cluster of flowers at the top. This is also called false dragon head. And it's called obedient plant. I always wondered why it was called obedient, because when I have it in my garden, it does not tend to behave itself. It sort of wants to spread pretty easily. It's obedient because you can twist those flower stems, and they tend to stay in the direction that you twist them. So that's the obedient part of it. It's in the mint family. It prefers full sun, but it'll take a little bit of shade. This is hardy up to zone 3, and you can get white or pink flowers. It's good for areas that you maybe don't have great drainage in, very attractive to hummingbirds, good nectar production for pollinators later on in the season. But again, as I said, it is a self-seeder, and it does grow by rhizomes. So you do have to kind of pay attention to it. But the roots are pretty shallow, so they're kind of easy to pull out. And it claims to be deer resistant. There's that cardinal flower as another alternative again. The next, I'm going to do two invasives together because the alternatives are very similar. So I'll talk about those two invasives first, and then I'll give you a couple alternatives. The first one is porcelain berry. And this is, again, if you look at those beautiful berries, you can see why someone would want to plant this. They just produce these berries that almost look like little birds' eggs. They're so, all different colors of blues and purples, speckles. Very colorful. So it's a deciduous, woody, perennial vine. But those vines, if you look in this bottom picture, you can see what happens when those vines take off. Over 25 feet long. The seeds are spread by the wildlife because they're eating those berries, and it has a very hardy root system, and it can just take over those open areas again if it escapes into those places. And it can outcompete not just herbaceous and small shrubby plants, but it can actually outcompete large trees as well. So it was brought in as an ornamental ground cover, and it really does take over as a ground cover, ground cover. And it is still used. It's not allowed to be used to be sold or transported or propagated in New York State, but it is still used in the horticulture trade in other areas. So that's the first one of the first invasive that I wanted to mention. And then the second one is one that I think everybody is pretty familiar with at this point, and that's the Oriental Bittersweet. And again, it's for these beautiful berries that people like this particular plant. You may not be growing this in your garden or your landscape, but a lot of times what happens, people see those and they bring them into the yard, they make wreaths out of them, and then when the seed coats fall off and they want to get rid of the wreath, they throw it in the garbage, they throw it up on the compost heap, they throw it up in the woods, and they've just caused some issues with it becoming more invasive. And it grows very quickly, and it will grow on, and it will cling to anything. If it doesn't have something else to cling to, it will grow on itself. It will actually twine on itself. And look at this, you can grow up to 90 feet tall. But probably one of the most destructive parts of this, as you can see in this picture, is once it starts to twine around another plant, even up to trees, you can see that it actually starts to girdle that plant, and it doesn't allow the resources, the water and the nutrients, to go up into that plant. It causes the plant to weaken, the branches become weaker, then you have a storm. The storm, then you've got a weak plant, it can actually topple over the trees. Actually, for the weight of that vine can actually cause trees to topple over. So it really is a definite problematic invasive species. And again, it doesn't really have any predators or diseases, so it can run rampant in our environments. So what could you grow instead? Well, there actually is a native bittersweet, and it also has beautiful berries, just like the Oriental, but it's not as aggressive a grower. It's pretty fast growing, but it has a lower pollen viability, so that tends to sort of rein it in a little bit more. But you do, if you're going to be growing this, if you're going to plant this in your garden or in your landscape, you do want to take care to make sure you're pruning that. And it can take a pretty hardy prune. You can cut this down to ground level in the springtime, and you're still going to get growth on that new wood. So you have to be mindful. It's a vine. If you're going to grow a vine, you're going to get vine behavior. These plants also are dioecious, and if you need to have both a male and a female if you want to produce fruit. The female vines produce the fruit. In this case, the males do not. And again, if you're not managing it, it can do some similar damage. So if you're going to grow it, you want to grow it on a fence, on a trellis, on an arbor. If you got a chain link fence that you kind of want to hide, this might be something that you would want to put there. But those fruits are also really attractive to wildlife. In birds in particular, it attracts songbirds. But it also produces some of our forest birds like ruffed grouse, pheasants, turkey, bobwhite. So it's an interesting alternative. What else could you grow? This is another alternative, trumpet honeysuckle. And this, not to be confused with trumpet creeper, which is a different, that's the campus radicans. I think they're even considering putting that one on the invasive species list. I'm not sure about that, but I know it is listed as an alternative, but it tends to really take over. So this one is trumpet honeysuckle or coral honeysuckle. It flowers best. the more sun you give it. But you can see how beautiful those flowers are. And you can tell just by looking at the shape of those flowers that that's going to be really attractive to our hummingbirds. It's hardy up to zone 4. It does like a rich soil. And if it also, I'm getting messages on my computer telling me that my computer is old. So ignore the pop-ups if you see them. If you want, you do need to give it some good light, some good air circulation, good drainage. Otherwise, it does have a tendency to develop powdery mildew. So that's something to be mindful of. If you're going to use it as a climber, you want to give it a structure to climb on, but it is considered a nice ground cover. If you want it, you've got an area that you want to, create a colorful sprawl, you can allow it to grow, and it'll grow, 20 feet. So again, you have to be mindful of that. It is a vine, but it's not as aggressive as say the trumpet creeper that I mentioned. It's attractive again to hummingbirds, to bees, to butterflies. The fruits of this are also attractive to purple finches, goldfinches, one of my favorites, hermit thrush, robins, quail. They're all attracted to the fruits of this. And it is the larval host to the spring azure butterfly. And also the snowberry clearwing moth. It is the larval host for that. It's fairly deer resistant. I have not grown this, but claims are that it is deer resistant. A couple other alternatives, foxgrape and Dutchman's pipe, which actually is not native to Rensselaer County. It has been seen, it's probably escaped, it's been found, I know, in Saratoga County, but it's a real interesting plant that I'm thinking about that one because it's got an interesting flower structure to it. Okay, here's our, I believe this is our final invasive that we're talking about today, and that's the border privet. It's a woody shrub, and it's grown primarily for its hedge-like qualities. That's why it was brought here as an ornamental in the 1800s to grow as a privacy hedge. Grows tall and wide, produces lots of fruit. It grows quickly, and it reproduces both through seeds and through root suckers. And again, it can form, you can see from that lower picture, it can form these very dense thickets that will actually crowd out anything that's trying to grow underneath it. This was native to Asia, to Japan, to China, to Korea. It was brought, and there are a bunch of different species that are invasive. There's glossy, Chinese, Japanese, California, Amer. So all of those border privets are all considered invasive. So instead, what could you do instead to create that sort of kind of a hedge-like look? Black chokeberry, and this is actually considered what Doug Ptolemy refers to as a keystone plant, because it has lots and lots of value for our native fauna. This is in the rose family, and it prefers full sun, but it'll tolerate some shade, and it's hardy up to zone 3, and it'll grow 3 feet up to 8 feet depending on how you position it. It tolerates a lot of soil types. It'll even tolerate road salt, which in upstate New York is sort of a pretty common thing to have causing problems. This develops a purple fruit, and that purple fruit lasts a long time, and it's called a chokeberry because it's very when the fruits first came out, they're very, very bitter. They would make you choke if you were to eat them. But over time, as that fruit stays on the plant, and particularly as it gets into the cold weather, as it freezes and thaws and freezes and thaws, it becomes sweeter and sweeter, and it actually is a very valuable fruit for our songbirds that might be staying here, birds that are staying here and overwintering and needing to fatten up, or for our migrating songbirds that need to fatten up for the trip. So this is a really valuable plant to have. It's also a nectar source for pollinators, ants, butterflies, honeybees, flies, hummingbirds. It spreads kind of slowly, but it'll form this thicket, and then, again, that's also shelter for birds. But it does produce suckers, so it does spread a little bit. And the foliage actually will turn sort of a reddish purple in the fall, so you kind of get an interesting interest later on in the season. But it is not particularly deer resistant. So that's something to be mindful of. Here's one other one for us. How about an American yew? You know, so a lot of us want to plant boxwood, and we have some problems with boxwood, but this might be an alternative to either your border privet or maybe a boxwood. It's also called the Canadian yew, and it likes shade, part shade to full shade. It'll actually grow hardy up to zone 3 again. Prefers, again, moist, cool soil. That's where it's going to grow best. It's a slow growing plant, but these bright red berries are very attractive to some birds, particularly again, another one of my favorite birds is the cedar waxwing, to robins, and again, also some of our forest birds, ruffed grouse, pheasants, are also attracted to this. Yews tend to be toxic, though, to our livestock, to cattle, horses and cattle. And again, it is not particularly deer resistant. It's actually a preferred food source for deer and even for moose. So you have to pay attention to that. A couple other alternatives, arborvitae, but we also know that that is not particularly deer resistant. You can see the deer doing their sort of sculptures. What are those called? That sculpture called? I can't remember what you call that, but that's another alternative. And inkberry. Inkberry may not be particularly hardy. It is a species of holly, so the claim is that it is hardy to zone 5, but I mostly see that down in lower areas. But that is a deer resistant alternative. So that was a whirlwind tour through some invasive species and then some native alternatives that you could consider looking at. So Betsy's now going to talk to us a little bit about invasive species mitigation, and then I'm going to just touch on some resources. Take it away, Betsy.
Okay. I mentioned earlier that in terms of dealing with invasive species, the first thing we need to do is identify it, then regulate it, and then remove and replace it. The New York IMAP Invasives is an online collaborative GIS-based database and mapping tool that serves as the official invasive species database for New York State, and you can find it at this website. You as a citizen scientist can go out and identify your invasive plants and then log it right into there, or you can contact the people who are coordinating the IMAP Invasive website to put that in for you. So they want to know where all the plants are located. This IMAP Invasives is the official New York State invasive database, but there are about 5 or 6 other states that also use this type of online file. But there is also another type of map called EDD maps, which stands for Early Detection and Distribution Mapping System. And many of the other states use that as well. So when you're looking online, you might find the EDS map as well. I wanted to mention that this IMAP Invasives is actually managed by an organization called PRISMS, which is the Partnership for Regional Invasive Species Management for New York State. And there are 8 PRISMs in our area, and they are really a consortium. They get their funding from DEC, but they're a consortium of both government and private organizations, as well as private citizens. So this you could consider as the management part of dealing with invasives, where they not only identify where they are, but they also deal with the management of it. And they also, it's very interesting that they tier the invasives according to how harmful they are and how easy they might be to mitigate. So they'll actually start working on the ones that aren't quite as invasive because they are still manageable. So they look at all of that. It's rather interesting organization, and it's nice to know that they're there. Cathy and I thought you might be interested too in this website called Invasive Assessment Scores and Ranks for 183 non-native plants in New York State. This was put out in 2013. And they do rank the plants, and this was done by the Brooklyn Botanical Garden. they rank them according to, not very invasive to highly invasive. So it's interesting to just sort of go through the list and see which ones they considered what. And I think that's all that I need. I think this will be in our list, won't it, Kathy?
Yes.
Okay, very good. Okay.
Just kind of a highlight, a couple local resources, and there are others where you can get native plants in a variety of places, but some folks kind of specialize in them. Actually, the Capital Native Plants is operated by our own Rhonda Rumsey Van Hovelen, who's one of our panelists today. And I'll give you more information on the resource list that David sends out, contact information, where it's located. So you'll get all of that information as well. I think, Rhonda, I don't know if you're in the wintertime. I know that you're at the Troy Farmers Market and the Schenectady Green Market as well. Catskill Native Nursery is down in Kerhonkson, so it's a little bit of a haul, but apparently I have not been there, but I've heard that it's just really a fabulous place to go. Gade Farms is right out in Altamont, and Helia is in West Stockbridge, and Wild Things Rescue Nursery is up in Valley Falls. So those are a couple local alternative places for those alternative native plants that you might be looking for. And then in terms of the plants, this gets a little overwhelming. We had a lot of material that we used to develop this, but I just mentioned these kind of top three. This is a great resource for identifying other alternatives to invasive plants. So that might be one to look for. You'll again get that on the list. This is the document that I showed you, that blue document that lists all 75 of the plants. And then this one, this is a really fabulous resource because you can go to your county, you can search by your county, and it will tell you all of the native plants that are present in your county. So you can really drill down to see, is this plant native to where I live in my county? So that's really interesting. And then, look, there's just tons more resources that we'll provide to you. You don't have to try and copy all these down. It's just a little too much. So that's, oh, Betsy, do you want to just maybe give a little teaser for what's going to be happening in April around native plants?
Well, our little working group is going to present another webinar, this time talking more in detail about how to start it, how to grow garden natives, how to create your own native garden, maybe with the focus on the homegrown national park.
Okay, excellent, great. So and just one other thing I wanted to share with you, if I can get, I might not be able to get to it. Let me see. Something that I located. This is from DEC. So if you're thinking about what do I do with those things that I've got in my garden, this is guidelines for disposing of invasive plant material. And I found this after I put together the resource list. But if you just do, disposing of invasive plants in New York State, you can actually access this, which is just a really good, it just explains ways to get rid of plants, and, it's a useful additional resource.